Look at the map, not the modern one, with its clean borders, its highways, its color-coded nations. Look at the ancient one, the one drawn not by diplomats but by the land itself. To the west, the Mediterranean Sea, vast and unforgiving. To the east, the Syrian desert, impassable for armies without water. To the south, the Sinai Peninsula, a furnace of stone and sand stretching toward Egypt. To the north, the mountain ranges of Lebanon and Syria, channeling movement into narrow passes. And between all of these, a thin sliver of land, barely 70 miles wide at its broadest point. A corridor so narrow that in some places a soldier could see both the sea and the desert in the same morning. This is the land historians would call Canaan, then Israel, then Palestine. A territory that changed names as often as it changed rulers. And it changed rulers constantly, not because its people were weak, but because its location was irresistible. For 4,000 years, this corridor was not merely a place people lived. It was the hinge of the ancient world. To understand why, you have to understand what geography meant before the age of flight, before the age of steam, before the Suez Canal rewrote the map of trade. In the ancient world, moving armies and moving goods required roads, and roads followed the path of least resistance, around mountains, through valleys, along coastlines. The land we now call Israel sat precisely at the point where three continents converged, where the only viable land route between Africa, Asia, and Europe ran through a single, unavoidable bottleneck. The Egyptians understood this first. As early as the 16th century before the Common Era, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom began marching northward through Canaan with regularity. Not because they wanted the land itself, the Nile Valley was far more fertile, far more productive. They wanted the road. Thutmose III, one of the most formidable military commanders in Egyptian history, campaigned in Canaan no fewer than 17 times over 2 decades. 17 campaigns. Each time crossing the same terrain, fighting for the same passes, the same harbor cities, the same northern approaches. His victory at the Battle of Megiddo, fought in a mountain pass overlooking what is today the Jezreel Valley, was not incidental. Megiddo sat at the threshold of the entire northern corridor. Whoever held Megiddo held the road. Whoever held the road controlled whether armies moved, whether merchants traded, whether grain flowed between Egypt and the civilizations of Mesopotamia. The Egyptians were not the only ones who understood this. Far to the north and east, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, empires rose and collapsed with the regularity of the seasons. The Mitanni, the Hittites, Assyria, Babylon. Each in turn pushed westward toward the same narrow land, the same coastal plain, the same mountain passes. They were not pursuing ideology or religious vision. They were pursuing logistics. An empire that controlled the Levantine corridor could tax the caravans, requisition their army's passage, and threaten rivals from both directions simultaneously. An empire that lost the corridor became geographically isolated, strangled by its own borders. This is why the Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BCE between the Egyptian forces of Rameses II and the Hittite armies of Muwatalli II, happened where it did. The city of Kadesh sat in modern-day Syria, near the northern edge of what we might broadly call the contested zone. Two of the most powerful empires on Earth collided there not because Kadesh was valuable in itself, but because both understood that whoever controlled that axis controlled everything south of it. The battle ended in a negotiated peace, one of history's earliest recorded treaties. But the peace was strategic, not ideological. Neither empire had the strength to seize the corridor outright. So they divided the approaches and watched each other carefully across a geographic boundary both knew was temporary. The land caught in between paid the price for all of this. The Canaanite city-states, scattered along the coastal plain and through the valleys, found themselves perpetually subject to the strategic calculations of distant capitals. Tribute flowed to Egypt in one generation, to the Hittites in the next, to whatever power happened to be projecting force through the region at the moment. The people who lived and farmed and traded in these valleys were not primarily actors in their own story. They were, by virtue of their location, permanent subjects of someone else's imperial ambition. This pattern did not change when the political map changed. Around the 12th century BCE, the great empires of the Bronze Age collapsed in a cascade of catastrophe that scholars still debate. The Hittite Empire disintegrated. Egypt contracted. The Mycenaean civilization vanished. In the vacuum left behind, new peoples moved into the corridor. Among them, the Israelites, whose tribal confederacy gradually consolidated into a monarchy under Saul and then under David around 1000 BCE. For a brief period, historically speaking, a few generations, a unified Israelite state under David and then Solomon controlled the corridor without a dominant external power pressing from either end. But the geography had not changed. Only the powers had. When the Assyrian Empire rose to dominance in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, it began projecting force westward along the same routes the Egyptians had marched 3 centuries earlier. The campaigns of Tiglath-Pileser III reached the Levantine coast. The army of Shalmaneser V besieged Samaria, the capital of the northern Israelite kingdom, for 3 years before breaching its walls in 722 BCE. Sargon the Tech deported thousands of its inhabitants, the so-called 10 lost tribes, dispersing them across the Assyrian heartland as a deliberate policy of demographic disruption. The goal was not annihilation, it was pacification. A people without a homeland could not coordinate resistance along a road the empire needed. 40 years later, it was the Assyrian king Sennacherib who marched south, laying siege to city after city in Judah until only Jerusalem itself remained. The famous account of that siege, preserved both in Assyrian annals and in the Hebrew scriptures, describes 46 walled cities captured, vast numbers of people deported, Hezekiah king of Judah trapped, like in Sennacherib's own words, a bird in a cage. Jerusalem survived for reasons that remain debated by historians, but the pattern was unmistakable. Assyria needed the corridor. The corridor's inhabitants would pay the price of Assyria's need. When Babylon replaced Assyria as the dominant power, it marched the same roads. Nebuchadnezzar II besieged Jerusalem twice, in 597 BCE and again in 586 BCE, when he finally breached the walls, burned the temple, and deported the Judahite elite to Babylon. The Babylonian exile is remembered in Jewish tradition as a defining catastrophe, but in geopolitical terms, it followed a logic that was by then almost routine. A new empire had risen. It needed the corridor. It secured the corridor by eliminating the most politically coherent entity that might resist it. The Persians came next. Under Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire absorbed Babylon in 539 BCE and promptly reversed Babylon's population policy, issuing the famous decree that allowed deported peoples, including the Judahites, to return to their homelands. This was not sentimentality. A restored loyal population in the Levantine corridor was more useful to Persia than a resentful, displaced one. The road needed reliable administrators, not burning resentment. The Greeks, when they came, brought something new, and not just armies, but an entire civilizational system. Alexander of Macedon swept through the corridor in 332 BCE on his way to Egypt, meeting serious resistance only at the island city of Tyre, which he defeated through a feat of engineering that still commands admiration. Building a causeway across a half-mile of open sea to reach the city's walls. Gaza resisted briefly. Egypt surrendered. The corridor had been crossed in a matter of months. After Alexander's death, his generals divided the empire. The corridor fell into a zone of contest between the Ptolemies, based in Egypt, and the Seleucids, based in Syria. For over a century, these two successor dynasties fought 6 major wars across the same terrain that Egyptians and Hittites had contested 1,000 years earlier. The battles had different names. The commanders spoke Greek instead of Egyptian or Akkadian, but the strategic logic was unchanged. The corridor was the prize. Whoever held it held the connective tissue of the Eastern Mediterranean world. The Romans, when their power finally extended eastward, absorbed the region in 63 BCE under the general Pompey. Jerusalem surrendered after a 3-month siege. The Romans were, if nothing else, methodical about their administration of strategic geography. The Levantine corridor was too important to leave to local instability. When the Judean leadership proved fractious, Rome appointed client kings. When the client kings proved unreliable, Rome sent governors. When the governors' policies sparked revolt, as they did catastrophically in 66 CE, Rome responded with overwhelming military force under Vespasian, and then his son Titus. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE was not, from Rome's perspective, a religious act. It was a strategic decision. An insurgency along the corridor between Egypt and Syria could not be tolerated. The rebellion was crushed with a thoroughness that echoed across centuries. What is remarkable, looking back across this entire arc of history, is not the violence itself. Violence was the grammar of the ancient world. What is remarkable is the persistence of the pattern. Empire after empire, millennium after millennium, the same geography compelled the same strategic calculations. The names changed, the religions changed, the languages changed, but the land did not change. The narrow coastal plain remained narrow. The mountain passes remained unavoidable. The desert to the east and the sea to the west remained impassable. The corridor remained the corridor. There is a concept geographers call a shatterbelt, a region that, by virtue of its location between competing powers, experiences disproportionate conflict regardless of its internal character. The term was coined in the 20th century, but the phenomenon it describes is ancient. The land of Israel was perhaps the original shatterbelt, not cursed by the divine, not doomed by any failure of its peoples, but simply situated at the most contested intersection on the ancient map of the world. The armies came because they had to. The road led through, and whoever controlled the road controlled the connections between civilizations. The merchants who moved spices from Arabia to Egypt, grain from Egypt to Mesopotamia, timber from Lebanon to the building projects of a dozen capitals, all of them passed through this narrow corridor. To tax that movement, to direct it, to deny it to rivals, was to hold a lever that could move empires. What does it mean to live in such a place? To plant a field knowing that an army might cross it before the harvest. To build a city knowing that a siege might reduce it to rubble in your children's lifetime. To maintain a culture, a language, a faith across generations of occupation and displacement and return. The historical record suggests that the peoples of this corridor developed, of necessity, extraordinary capacities for adaptation and survival. Cultures that might have been smoothed into irrelevance by repeated conquest instead maintained distinct identities through centuries of foreign rule. The Israelite tradition of monotheism, which crystallized in part during the Babylonian exile, survived deportation, persecution, and the destruction of its central institution. The question of how small peoples endure within large geopolitical forces is one the ancient world posed most sharply in this particular strip of land. The geography did not answer that question, but it asked it repeatedly with an insistence that history has not forgotten. Stand today in the Jezreel Valley where Thutmose III maneuvered his armies 4,000 years ago, where the chariots of Assyria rolled southward 6 centuries after that, where Alexander passed through with barely a pause, where the Crusaders would fight medieval battles in exactly these same passes, where British forces under Allenby would maneuver in 1918, where tanks would cross again in 1948 and 1967. The valley is green now, cultivated, crossed by modern roads and railway lines. But the shape of it has not changed. The mountains still funnel movement. The passes still control access. The corridor remains. Corridor? And we are left with a question the ancient world never fully resolved, and that our own century has not answered either. When geography creates conflict so reliably across such vast stretches of time, is conflict the inevitable fate of the people who live there? Or does understanding the mechanism, recognizing that armies came not because of theology or ethnicity or cultural superiority, but because of roads, make possible something that 4 millennia of history has only glimpsed? A future shaped by human choice rather than topographic necessity? The map is ancient. The question is ours. This documentary is based on historical research, archaeological evidence, and verifiable scholarly sources. Images and videos generated by artificial intelligence were used to illustrate and dramatize historical events. Thanks for watching. See you in the next episode.